Hello, I'm Cindy Henry, Member and Guest Services Manager at Greater Burlington Partnership. Welcome to Success in Business. Today, John Kirchner, the Executive Director, Midwest Region Congressional and Public Affairs Division of the U.S. Chamber, is with us. John represents chambers throughout Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, North and South Dakota, and Wisconsin. He helps develop and implement the Chamber's grassroots, legislative, and political activities in the area. He works closely with state and local chambers, as well as members of Congress in his region, to further the legislative priorities of the Chamber. We're so glad to have him with us to talk to us today. Please welcome John Kirchner.
Thank you, Cindy. Cindy, excuse me. Welcome everyone joining us today. Glad to have you here. Again, my name is John Kirchner. I work for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce at our Twin Cities regional office. And as she said, I cover 6 states in the upper Midwest. I spend most of my time traveling across the upper Midwest doing briefings like this in person and virtually now in this new world. And I'm thankful to be here with you all today. What I'm going to do is provide just kind of a quick update on what's happening in Washington, what we're working on in terms of what we're seeing in DC, provide a little bit of a political update, and then certainly take any questions that you may have. So with that, I'll begin here. Kind of the foremost issue we hear from chambers of commerce and businesses around the country are the number one issue is workforce. We don't have enough workers. And there are about 10.9 million job openings right now, 2.9 million fewer Americans working now than there were in February of 2020. And the reality of it is there are 4.6 million more job openings right now than there are unemployed workers currently looking for work. So if we had full employment and everybody had a job in America, we'd have about 4.6 million jobs still left unopened. So workforce is a significant issue. Part of it is an issue that's a result of COVID and the pandemic and how we've handled that. But part of the bigger issue is we just don't have enough workers. And so we need to find a solution to that. And I believe that, there's a lot of different elements to fixing that problem, but certainly I believe smart immigration reform is one way to tackle that issue. Moving on, if we talk about a job survey that we recently conducted, I'll walk through here. 53% of Americans who became unemployed during the pandemic say they are only somewhat active or not active at all in terms of looking for work. So there's a lot of folks who are on the sidelines right now that are not currently looking for work that we need to get back into the workforce. 13% of those surveyed have left multiple jobs during the pandemic. So there's certainly a lot of job hopping going on. Changing industries, as mentioned here, 32% want to and expect to switch industries at some point. And then among those currently unemployed who've had multiple jobs since April of 2020, 57% of them held their most recent position for 3 months or less. So there's a lot of transitoriness happening in the workforce right now, which is only aggravating some of the issues that our employers have across the country and certainly across Iowa. Well, with all these folks staying out of work, how are they staying afloat? That's a good question that we asked. A lot of them are utilizing income from other members of their household, about 45%. About 48% are spending some of the remaining stimulus money that has been sent out over the course of the last couple of years. 47% are dipping into their savings to stay afloat. And 56% believe they can get by for 6 months. 26% think they can hold out for an entire year before they have to go back into the workforce. And one point I overlooked here is that spending the remaining expanded unemployment benefits, 36%. So some people have saved up some of their stimulus money. Some people saved up some of the extra unemployment benefits, and they're still living off that. So, 56% of those folks believe they could still get by for another 6 months. So this isn't an issue, it appears, that's going to be fixing itself in the near future. Where did everybody go, right? Over 3 million people were driven into early retirement as a result of COVID, which we've all seen in our businesses and our communities. 1.5 million fewer mothers of school-age children are currently in the workforce. So with daycares that were shut down and schools that were shut down to varying degrees around the country, that burden to care for those kids fell much more on the mothers, it appears, which is not surprising. And 1.5 million of them have yet to return to the workforce as a result of that. So maybe that's a result of, maybe it's a permanent change, maybe it's a temporary change. But it's important to note 2 million fewer immigrant workers because of COVID. A lot of those being higher educated certainly is a component of this as well. We shut the borders down. We allowed fewer visas to get in for working. So that's something that we need to address as well. When you take 3 million driven into early retirement and 3.5 million in the other two categories, we're talking about 6.5 million people who were in the workforce before who are not there right now, which is only exacerbating our workforce challenges. So we asked which of the following would increase your urgency to return to full-time employment. So how are employers going to be able to incentivize employees to return? 40% said $1,000 hiring bonus would get back, more flexible work order or hours, positive work environment, being able to work from home. So there's a lot of these changing workforce dynamics. Part of it's money, but it's not entirely money because they're living on saved up money right now. So $1,000 hiring bonus would be nice, but there are other elements as well in terms of what would bring them back, better health care, things of that nature. So as you're thinking as a business owner on how to get folks back into the workforce, particularly into your workforce, there's some good information here that you may want to look at in terms of what you can do to attract some additional talent. The other big issue, in addition to workforce that we're seeing around the upper Midwest, but certainly the country as a whole, is inflation. This is real. It's not a short-term inflationary period as some of the Biden administration suggested it might be last year. But if you just look at inflation by the numbers here, inflation's up 7.5% on an annual basis. That's the highest in almost 40 years that it's been. Used cars are up, the cost is up 30%. New cars, the cost is up 17%. Energy, 29.3%, food, 6.3%. And a lot of us could say, well, I can go by without getting a new car or a used car anytime soon, but we all have to have energy to heat our homes. We all have to have energy to drive our vehicles. We're all buying food. So this isn't something that just affects certain parts of the economy, but it's affecting the economy as a whole. So, what caused this inflation? There's certainly a number of contributing factors. Obviously, the excessive fiscal stimulus as a result of COVID was significant. 68% of our workforce earn more money on unemployment than they did when they were employed. So giving people a bunch of money to not work certainly caused a significant part of this. Now, those expanded unemployment benefits have ended, but as I mentioned in earlier slides, a lot of folks have saved that money and are still living on that money. But in addition to that, we have the workforce shortages, which are making it harder to get products built, made, serviced to market, and supply chain issues as well. So there's not one sort of issue, but they're all interrelated, certainly as it relates to COVID in terms of, all the excess stimulus, the workforce shortages that COVID has caused, supply chain issues, which is somewhat related to COVID, somewhat related to workforce. And so there's a lot of different issues that are coming into play here, and to understand what has caused this inflationary period that we're in. And we expect the Fed to raise rates and for inflation to hopefully subside late 2020 or early 2023. So we're probably in this period for the better part of another year at a minimum is what we'd guess. And then we can also look at what's happening abroad right now in Ukraine. And while that's half a world away, the reality is that's going to drive up the cost of energy, fuel, gasoline, oil, all of those things even further. So this energy that's up 29.3%, we expect to see that number increase even more as a result of some of the conflicts that are happening abroad right now. What we're also seeing with inflation is that wages are growing strong. Businesses are paying employees more to get them back to work. That wages are growing very strong, but inflation is outpacing the wage growth, right? And so wage growth, at 4.7%, while with inflation at 7.1%, you might be making more money, but you're bringing home less because it's costing you more money to buy goods and services and products out there. So it's good to see the wage growth up, but until we get this inflation under control, our employees aren't going to be really feeling that wage growth as much as they should or could. The other big issue is supply chain issues. Certainly, we've seen that in terms of the how long it's taking products to get to market. Lockdowns were certainly impactful globally. Our supply chain isn't just local anymore. It's never been more global and interconnected to the rest of the world than it is now. So as lockdowns, even though different parts of the United States have opened up more quickly than other parts of the world, we still rely on those other parts of the world to provide a lot of goods and services and products to us. So that certainly has been an element. Spending habits have changed. We imported 23% more products from January to September of last year than we did in the same period of 2020. So we're importing more, which puts even more stress on our international supply chain. Infrastructure investment has not taken place, has not kept pace. So our roads, our bridges, our rail, our freight, the way we get our goods and services to market haven't been maintained particularly well. That's slowing it down. There's a workforce shortage, as I talked about earlier, but the trucking industry has been hit specifically hard by the workforce. There's 3 times the amount of trucking companies went out of business in 2020 and 80,000 open trucking jobs right now, right? And so when we talk about putting more stress on our infrastructure and our truckers to get our products and goods and services to market, when you've got 80,000 fewer drivers, that means there's more of a backlog in terms of getting those products to market. Rail capacity is running at 120% right now, and our ports are operating. We're operating about 16 hours per day. A lot of them are now up to 24 hours per day, and due to some labor issues, have resisted a lot of the automation. So a lot of these ports, particularly the ones on the West Coast, are backlogged, and we'll get into that a little bit. But automation could solve a lot of those problems, but the long-term effects of automation is probably fewer workers, right? And the labor unions don't want that. So that's another certainly contributing factor. Some of the impacts of supply chain issues on the business community. A year ago, it cost about $3,000 to ship a container from China to the United States. Right now, that number is closer to $30,000. So there's been a 10-fold increase in the cost of just shipping a container, the exact same container with the exact same products in it, over the course of a year. And that's the first price increase in 10 years, and it went up 10 times in 1 year. Typically, a retailer is going to stock 2 months of inventory. Right now, they're at 30 days or less. And so that's why we're seeing a lot of empty shelves and seemingly random products, it seems. There's not a lot of rhyme or reason to what shelves are going to be empty on any given day. It's just a matter of what products are able to get to your store on that day. And but a lot of this on the port issue is isolated to the West Coast, to California. The European supply chain and our East Coast or Gulf Coast ports have been less interrupted, but the ones on the West Coast that are largely coming from Asia have been interrupted far more. And if we look ahead, how long is this going to last? Is it going to get worse before it gets better? We can still see ships at anchor. This is a great port. Ships at anchor. This is Long Beach. There are 103 container ships currently anchored outside of the port in Long Beach, California, because they're backlogged and can't get them processed and moved through enough through that port. Which that's really the main port for the United States on the West Coast. The ports on the East Coast aren't as bad, but it's very difficult and costly to get a ship from Asia over to the East Coast, obviously. The Chinese New Year is going to cause a week-long delay, which is going to be significant. And our longshoreman labor contracts are set to be renewed this year. So if there's potential for labor strife as well, if the longshoremen and those working in those ports decide they want to leverage this backlog for better wages, better benefits, whatever that might be. So I think this supply chain issue is likely to be here for quite a while, and it's not going to get better anytime soon. What are small businesses saying? During this time last year, 33.5% of small business needed financial assistance or additional capital. So about a third of small businesses a year ago said we need more money or capital to keep our doors open. The good news is that number has dropped to about 16% this year. So it's been almost more than cut in half, which is great because it says our small businesses are doing well and are succeeding. The converse side of that is 40.6% are looking to expand their workforce compared to 23.6% a year ago. So while half the businesses say they need more support and capital to keep their doors open, twice as many businesses are saying we want to hire more workers. So that's a very good sign in terms of how our small businesses are coming out of this protracted, pandemic and various shutdowns. 63% of small businesses have increased their prices over the last year, and 74% are concerned about inflation. So I think we're going to continue to see more price increases on our goods and services and products over the course of the next year as it relates to inflation. And there's certain contingents of the Biden administration and other governors around the country that are blaming a lot of this inflation and cost increase on businesses. And the reality is that's not the case. We know that at some point the businesses are going to have to, pass those costs along to their consumers, or they're not going to be able to stay open for business. And so it's important that we get this inflation under control, so that otherwise we're going to continue to see prices go up, and it's going to be harder to slow that train down, so to speak. One more stat here, 61% of small businesses say their supply chain has been dramatically disrupted, which is no surprise. And 18% expect this as their biggest challenge post-COVID, right, is going to be supply chain issues in terms of getting the parts and the goods and services into their store, into their shop, into their business, whatever it might be. So this affects big businesses, small businesses, and everybody in between. Moving a little bit from kind of the state of the economy, so to speak, into this year, we'll talk about politics, certainly because politics is going to be driving what Congress is doing or isn't doing this year. And I don't have a lot in this presentation to talk about what's going to be happening this year because we don't anticipate a whole lot happening. I think, we've got some international issues that are happening, certainly on the global scale. There's going to be a Supreme Court nominee. We've got to keep the government open, things like that. But it's an election year, and these members of Congress want to be home campaigning more than they want to be in Washington, debating bills and taking hard votes on issues in an election year. So a lot of what's going to drive what happens this year in Washington is going to be back home in your districts and states in terms of politics. So if we get into the political side of it, the right track, wrong track for the direction for the country. Right now, 28% of the country think we're heading in the right track. About 65% think we're heading in the wrong track. And you can see that those numbers, that gap on the far right is spreading, not getting closer right now. So that kind of gives you a sense for where the country feels how we are doing politically and as a country. If you look at President Biden's approval rating, right now his approval rating is about 40%. His disapproval rating is about 54%. And Obama's midterm approval rating was 45.5, and Republicans gained 63 seats in the House that year. And in 2018, President Trump's midterm approval rating was higher than Biden is right now, and Democrats gained 41 seats in the House that year. So that's a significant number as we start looking at do these numbers improve over the course of this year. And if you look back in about August of this year, where the right track and the wrong track numbers collide and passed and went in different directions, that's linked entirely to the U.S. withdrawal of Afghanistan. If you follow the news in terms of how that withdrawal went, and I'm not making certainly any comments about how good or bad it was, but how that was perceived in the media and how that story was been told, was kind of the immediate trigger factor for President Biden's numbers going upside down. And he has not been able to recover from that. COVID is certainly a part of that in terms of his handling of COVID. Certainly the economy, inflation does not help that issue at all. And we're seeing, again, on the global scale, what's happening in Ukraine is likely going to have an impact. Maybe a positive impact, we don't know yet, but it's something to keep an eye on. If we look at the generic congressional ballot, what this is, they'll make out a call in a poll and say, on a generic ballot, would you be more likely to vote for a Republican or a Democrat right now for Congress? No names attached to it, no members of Congress. In 2010, that number was Republican plus 9.4. In 2018, that number was Democrat plus 7.3. And if you looked at those numbers, you remember in 2010, Republicans picked up 63 seats. In 2018, Democrats picked up 41. That number right now has Republicans with about a 4-point generic ballot. So that's certainly an advantage for Republicans as they look forward to what and how many seats they're going to be able to pick up and which seats they are. On the Senate side, there's 34 seats up this year on the Senate side, 20 are Republican, 14 are Democrat. Only about 9 of those 34 are considered competitive. They kind of, right now, 4 of them are Democrat seats, 5 of them Republicans. There are 6 of those are kind of toss-up seats, split evenly, three Republican seats, 3 Democrat seats. And if Republicans are going to get control, as you know, right now there's a 50-50 Senate. If they're going to get control, they're going to have to pick up a couple seats and avoid losing too many seats. And right now the Republicans are pushing hard in Arizona, Georgia, New Hampshire, and Nevada are where they see their pickup opportunities are. But they're certainly going to be playing defense in Pennsylvania, in North Carolina, in Wisconsin, and other states as well. So there's certainly places that Republicans have to play pickup. So well, it seems to be a somewhat foregone conclusion that the Republicans will be in control in the House. That is yet to be determined in terms of what's going to happen in the Senate as we look forward to the election this year. One good maybe telling point in terms of how these elections are going and what the feeling of the electorate is if you were to look back, and this is a long way from Iowa and a long way from Minnesota from where I am, but if you look at the Virginia gubernatorial election last year, a Republican took that seat over. I'd say if you were to ask many political people in September, October, how likely that was, probably very unlikely. But if you look at what Governor Youngkin, how he did that, he outperformed President Trump by 16% with independents and 6% with Republicans. So he's appealing not just to a hard right base, but he's appealing to the middle with his messaging. He outperformed the president by 9% with women. Similarly, a backdrop is 54% of the voters disapproved of Joe Biden's handling of his job as president. Youngkin won this group by 91%. So a big message part of it too, this last point, 51% of voters felt that parents should have a lot more say in what their schools teach, and he won that by 76%. So if you look at what Republicans are going to be talking about, I know this is a governor's election, but if you want to see what Republicans and even Democrats are going to be talking about in this election, a lot of it, I think, can be learned from that gubernatorial election that year, where there's a lot of independent voters that previously voted for a Democrat and voted for Joe Biden that are willing to vote for a Republican if they're right on these issues. And so I think that as you are looking at your campaigns that are going to be happening in Iowa this year, I think you're going to see some similarity in the messaging in terms of what folks are running in terms of offense and defensively. Some big successes we did have last year in terms of things that got done, the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act, the big, meaningful, once-in-a-generation infrastructure bill for roads and bridges, $550 billion in new spending over 8 years. It's going to streamline the approval and permitting process, so we're going to be able to get these jobs done more quickly. This is the single largest investment in bridges since the construction of the interstate highway system. And this replaces lead service lines and pipes to 10 million homes and 400,000 school and child care facilities in terms of clean water and things of that nature. So it's not just roads and bridges. If we look at really what's in it, this kind of additional transportation funding, roads and bridges, as I mentioned, water funding, broadband funding, energy funding across a lot of sectors all the way across the country. But we can look here specifically what it means for Iowa over the course of the next 5 years. $3.8 billion for highways and bridges, which is 27% more on an average annual basis, which is a significant amount of money. $13 million in improving roadway safety, almost $650 million in water infrastructure improvement, $7.5 million for electric vehicle charging network, and $120 million for airports. So a lot of significant resources coming to Iowa. And we talk about supply chain issues. One of those supply chain issues that we saw was a lack of investment in our roads and bridges and infrastructure. So this is going to be a good step forward for our business community in terms of being able to get those goods and services brought to market. So a very good, big success for the business communities. Bipartisan, 69 votes in the Senate. So 19 Republican senators voted for this bill. It was a closer vote, certainly in the House, but by that point, it became a lot more political than it had before. So certainly a significant victory for the business community. The other big victory for the business community, one was getting infrastructure passed. Another one was killing the Build Back Better Act, or reconciliation as it kind of became known. Is it dead? We think it's finally dead. This was one of those issues where we needed to get some of our friends on the Democratic side to help stop this from happening, right? It started out at $6 trillion. It went down to $3 trillion. If it comes back in any form, it's going to probably be dramatically less than that. But they were going to rely on taxing businesses to pay for this, which we certainly had a significant opposition to. And the other big issue with this bill is, it was only a 10-year bill, so it was going to go away after 10 years. And so, what was the real cost of this if they were to make this permanent? And if you look at this, it was, any given issue here, the 10-year estimate was, the White House estimated is $390 billion. A Penn Wharton study says it's $701 billion. And so there's child tax credits, $170 billion versus almost $2 trillion, right? And so this was going to be a significant spending bill. In addition to all the excess stimulus that we talked about that's causing a lot of the inflation, this was going to even cause any more inflation. And in addition to all the additional spending it included some elements of the PRO Act, which is kind of the pro-union, anti-business bill that got killed earlier. If you remember Card Check from years ago, the PRO Act is even worse than that. It kills right to work in Iowa and other states and things like that. So they slipped in some pro-union pieces into this legislation as well. But we were successful in working with both sides of the aisle to get that bill killed. If you want to look at the cost with some of the inflation as it relates to adding more money from Build Back Better, what that would look like on different products, from bacon to milk to electricity, it would cause costs of products to increase even more than they are right now as a result of inflation. So we felt this was a very important bill that we needed to oppose, that we needed to stand up for the business community and to stop. So, we're just trying to demonstrate that whether it's infrastructure or reconciliation, that the business community, business issues aren't Republican issues, aren't Democrat issues. They're Main Street issues, and we need Republicans and Democrats to work together to get important legislation passed or to stop bad legislation from happening. So these are two good examples of what we were able to do working with our friends on both sides of the aisle to get things done last year. And that's kind of all I have. I didn't want to occupy too much of your time, leave some time open for Q&A. As I mentioned, we anticipate legislatively this year is going to be relatively light due to the election and due to all the other things that are happening with Supreme Court, with keeping the government open and things like that. So I don't think we're going to see any major pieces of legislation. At least we don't foresee any right now. Something could always pop up. But I felt this would be a good time to give you a little outlook in terms of how we view the economy, inflation, workforce, politics a little bit in terms of what we're seeing as it's going to be driving the issues for this year, and then just celebrate some successes in terms of passing legislation, stopping some bad legislation from last year. So with that, I'm happy to see if we have any questions or comments in the chat. Okay, yeah, I do. What kind of infrastructure improvements were there for rail? Any for Iowa? I saw the statistics with rail running capacity right now. So if I go back, to the infrastructure. Oops, I passed it, excuse me. Right now for rail, I'll have to look. There was money for rail in Iowa because I know rail was a component of the broader bill. I didn't have specific numbers on rail for Iowa, but I can certainly look that up and get that back to our friends at the chamber to provide some information, because I know we're relying on rail, it seems, more than ever right now due to some of the other backlog we have. So I know there was some additional money for rail in there. And then Della asked, so Build Back Better is for sure dead this year? I wouldn't say for sure with anything that happens in Washington and happens in Congress, but we feel that in its current form, it is dead. I think Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema have established that they're not going to support it. In order to get it passed without their support, you'd have to get rid of the filibuster, which they've said they're not going to have happen. So if it does come back, I think it'll come back in a much smaller scale. But I think the bigger challenge right now is, given the extraordinary and historic rate of inflation we have right now, are the Democrats going to want to go and put another $1, $2, $3, $4, $5 trillion into the economy, which is only likely to add more inflation to what we're seeing right now. So unless they get desperate and really need something to run on, it's entirely possible something comes back. But to Della's question, I think the Build Back Better as we know it or was previously known is probably, hopefully, dead for good. Yeah, yeah, I did. Just kind of in closing, I want to thank again everyone for coming today. I want to thank Della and her team for your leadership down in Burlington. You're doing great things down there. I want to thank everybody who's on here reviewing. I want to thank you for being a member of your local chamber, for supporting Della and her team and all the good things that the Greater Burlington Partnership are doing. Obviously, much of our success at the U.S. Chamber is tied directly to our partnership with our state and local chambers. We couldn't have a better partner than we have in Burlington right now. So with that, I do see one more quick question here before I close. What is the U.S. Chamber anticipating on the workforce front in the coming year? I think we anticipate it's going to be more of the same. There aren't any silver bullets on workforce. Part of it is, we could say part of it is there's a lot of people that are out of the workforce right now that we talked about there that we need to get back in. That will help. There are some workforce training options that are good and can help train the workforce we have for the work we need. But the bigger issue is, like I said, if everyone that was on the sidelines right now came back to work, we'd still have 4.5 million more job openings. So that means we need to figure out a way to get more workers into our communities. And that's not just as simple as calling across the border and trying to lure people from Illinois or Wisconsin down into Iowa into Burlington. But that means we need to get more high-skilled, more low-skilled immigration into this country. And we need to have some smart immigration reform to bring in the workers we need for the job openings that we have. And I'm hoping that when you're talking to your members of Congress from Iowa and from Burlington, that you can stress that, because there's not a short-term fix that we have in terms of having more babies to fix that problem in the United States. That's a long-term fix, and we're having fewer and fewer every year. So the reality is we need more workers, and they have to come from some smart immigration reform. So hopefully we can certainly solve some of those problems with bringing some workers back. You know, some of those extended benefits have ended and people are going to run out of savings and need to come back. But we certainly are going to have to push hard on our leaders in Washington to help solve some of the more long-term problems. And a question here: how does Iowa compare to other states in my regions? It's very similar. And every chamber I go to and every business I talk to, the biggest issue they have isn't taxes, isn't healthcare, it's workforce. And certainly workforce inflation is part of that. The economy is part of that, but workforce is number one. And Iowa is no different from any other state that I have. And every state in my territory, their workforce attraction programs are targeting Iowa and their neighboring states to try to draw and lure employees from neighboring states to come into their state, while their neighbors are doing the same to them. So we're just robbing Peter to pay Paul in this workforce deck shuffling. And so we really need some long-term, meaningful reforms. Again, I keep repeating myself, but to our immigration system. But we need to get the people that are on the sidelines back into the workforce. And hopefully the ending of a lot of this stimulus will start that process. But there have been some meaningful structural changes in our workforce right now. A lot of people deciding to stay on the sidelines, to stay home, to care for their kids or the elderly. Some of those early retirements, maybe some of those people will come back into the workforce at some point. We're starting to see a little bit of that, but we have some significant structural problems that we need to address, and there's not a single solution to any of them. There are a lot of challenges that have a lot of different solutions, and we need to make sure our policymakers in Washington are hearing from us and willing to make those hard decisions on policies to help this problem. So with that, unless there's any more questions, I think my time has ended, and I want to thank you all for joining me, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much for being with us today, and to John Kirchner for updating us on the current issues. Please be sure to join us next month, and be sure to have your company's key contact person and your marketing person with us, as Dustin Roth, our Marketing and Communications Director here at the partnership, will be sharing information on how you can make the most of your chamber membership, utilizing all the great new bells and whistles that we have with our new system and our new website. Thanks again. See you next time.